The intersection of faith and politics, where there's struggle and pain, is the delivery room for the world we seek. That's where we need to be. I think Reverend Germanian is so right. This is this time and era and point that we've arrived at when a congregation really needs to step up. This is one of those times. You know, when I came up with the title for this sermon months ago, I was going to do the traditional thing that Unitarian Universalist ministers do on the Sunday before a big election, is to remind us what our principles are and voting our principles. But this time is a little different. Frankly, there's just one principle that really trumps all the others at this point. It's our fifth principle, that we uphold and support the democratic process and the right of conscience. You've seen the news, you hear it all the time. Democracy itself is under siege right now. It's not as important at the moment of how you vote, frankly, but we need to know if there's even going to be a fair election and how the results, once they're determined, how they're going to be determined and how they're going to be executed. So given where we are right now, I probably should have renamed the title of the sermon Democracy, Not for the Faint of Heart. This week I was involved with the UU The Vote organization. It's a wing of the Unitarian Universalist Association that was organized about 9 months ago specifically to help pay attention to democracy in this country and make sure that everyone had a fair chance to get out and vote and knew how to do it. They have come up with 4 different scenarios of how they expect the election to come out. Now, they didn't come up with this themselves. They just summarized it in the workshop I was in this week. And they're pretty straightforward. The first one is that the Republicans win. And if they do, it's likely that you're going to see a lot of people in the streets and political unrest like you saw 4 years ago, but probably even a lot bigger than it was 4 years ago. People that aren't exactly pleased with that outcome. The second one is the opposite. If the Democrats win, you're probably going to see people in the streets, but this time it's probably going to be led by the fascists and right-wing extremist groups, because they're not going to be very happy with that outcome. The third one, unfortunately, is that no one wins. There isn't a clear outcome for whatever reason, and we have almost complete chaos, like we did in the year 2000, and it goes to the Supreme Court, which we all know has a little bit of controversy around it right now. And the fourth, which I hope doesn't ever come, is a coup, that the current government loses power and it's clear, but refuses to leave. Regardless of what of these 4, what the outcomes are from these 4, it's pretty clear that there will be people in the streets. There will be protesters and counter-protesters. In fact, I heard on the news the other day that the FBI is planning for it. And it might even be weeks and months that they're expecting a lot of turmoil in American cities and a really unusual time for our election that we've frankly never had. So the UU The Vote group also pointed out that Unitarian Universalists generally tend to be reasonably secure. If you watch the media, you get all revved up at being fearful, but frankly, we tend to be reasonably secure in society and where we live, and relatively privileged compared to a lot of the historically marginalized people in our communities. And so they are urging us to consider that privilege and leveraging it in the days and weeks to come. They gave us the story of the first Universalist church. It's an old historic church in downtown Rochester, New York, and it was told by the Reverend Lane Campbell. Now, you may remember, I didn't actually at the time, that there was a African-American man, Daniel Prudy, who was having a psychotic episode last March and ended up being essentially strangled in police custody, which was unclear because he was hospitalized first and died a week later. And the whole outcome was kind of unclear until one of the body cameras, the footage from the body camera was shared in September. And at that point, it was pretty clear that there was excessive police force that had caused him to asphyxiate, and they had to actually revive him on the scene, but then he died. So, of course, that broke into rioting all over Rochester, New York. And within the first day or two, one of the historic black churches downtown decided to be the headquarters for people that needed refuge and to house medics and supplies. But unfortunately, it was deemed suspect by the police and was surrounded by the police and kind of had to shut down. Well, Reverend Campbell, being a downtown church, she's very connected with the other faith leaders in the downtown area, and she got a call from the minister there asking if they could do something. And this was on a moment's notice to help. She said she got the call about 3 o'clock, and by 7 o'clock that night, she had reached out to the board and the leaders, and they'd voted and decided to help, and they were set up. They'd cleared out their fellowship hall by 7 o'clock that night. They had places set up so the medics could do triage. They had supplies brought in. They had it staffed. They knew where funding might come to help continue it on. And she said this went on for weeks. Now, I'm not sure when this interview took place because it sounded like it was still happening. But it went on at least for weeks, if not a couple of months. The church was open until 2 a.m. every night. Because she says when there are protests, a lot of the violence always happens at night, and the medics are the last to leave. And so they had the church open until 2 a.m. and then later they dropped it back to midnight. And so this is a small Universalist congregation in downtown Rochester, but on the outskirts of town, there's a very, very large, it's one of our largest congregations, First Unitarian. And they joined together to help each other out. And so First Universalist had the right location in the right place with the right space to help out, but First Unitarian provided a lot of the volunteers and the funding to make it happen. So I thought it was an incredible story of a congregation stepping up at a moment's notice and making a difference in the community. And I've heard a lot of these stories, frankly, from my peers, my colleagues, and I kind of thought that we were a little isolated here in Northeast and Central Wisconsin. Sure, we had Black Lives Matter marches. I lived near the fellowship in Green Bay, and they were in the streets this summer, but were mostly peaceful, although a lot of businesses did board up their windows for fear of something happening. I know down in Fond du Lac, they had a really fantastic Juneteenth march, and there's been Black Lives Matter marches, but that have remained mostly peaceful. Stevens Point, I'm not sure. I never heard of anything big happening. So I thought, okay, we're involved like the rest of the country, but I think it's a safe place in Wisconsin to be. Then I changed my mind. Then, as I was watching the news about a week ago or so, time is slipping by, I was watching the coverage of the thwarted kidnapping of the Michigan governor. And I'm not sure if you paid attention to all the details of that, but they were describing how the white supremacist group had staked out her vacation home. And of course, they never said where it was, but I assume it was over closer to Lake Michigan or up by Traverse City near the upper end of the Lower Peninsula. And they staked out her home, and their plan was to kidnap her from her home, take her over the Mackinac Bridge to the Upper Peninsula, and then they said they would drive her, quote, to a safe place in Wisconsin to hide her. And it was just this little comment that the newscaster just moved on, and I sat up and went, what? They were going to hold this kidnapped governor in a safe place in Wisconsin. And it just dawned on me that safe place has to be within an hour or two drive of almost every congregation I serve. And suddenly it got real, my friends. Suddenly I realized that we knew that there were organizations like that up in the UP and sort of in northern Wisconsin on the other side of the border, but to have it so publicly proclaimed made me change my mind. That I think there's an honest possibility that when the protesters are in the streets, demanding democracy, they'll show up here, just like they did in Kenosha. And the UU the Vote organization, the purpose of the workshop this week was to talk about that and to say, do you have your congregations prepared for that? And so I'm going to share my screen again and show you a slide that they prepared. This was part of a congregational asset mapping tool that they pulled all together, and it actually had 7 points, but the 7th point was about helping out with the election. So I just narrowed it down to the 6 points that I want to talk about now. And I'm going to go through some of their key examples that I think apply to us in our situation here. And I'm spending a lot of time on it because today's question in the breakout session, I told you I wanted to make sure you stayed. Today's question is, how do you think our fellowship should respond to the unrest after Tuesday if needed? How do you think our fellowship, your fellowship, should respond to the unrest after Tuesday if needed? So let me unpack this a little bit. The first one is the church infrastructure, and they did update this with COVID in mind to make sure that they are thinking of that as they put this together. So the first one, like the church in Rochester, is there a staff member present or volunteers? Can you figure out a way to have the doors open if you wanted to use your infrastructure? Simple things like printing or making copies for people that need them in the streets. Can you store, sort, or distribute supplies? How about a parking lot or outside area that can be used to distribute materials, collect donations, or gather in a physically distant way? Green Bay and Fond du Lac each have small parking lots. Stevens Point doesn't have a parking lot, but you do have the yard behind the parsonage next door. So then that leads to the next question. Is there a way to put up some sort of a tent and tables and chairs to create sort of an outdoor socially distanced space? Is your church or congregation located in a highly visible location where signs and protests would be especially impactful? Green Bay is right on Main Street, and Fond du Lac is a block off of Main. I'm not so sure that Stevens Point is in a visible location, but the most important question under number 1 is your congregation located near active protests? And if so, could it function as a safe home base for street medics, movement chaplains, water station protesters, etc.? Well, clearly Green Bay and Fond du Lac, you're located right near downtown, and that's where the active protests are going to be. The Point Fellowship is a little bit south of downtown, but the Democratic Party headquarters is quite visible and only a block away, which could be susceptible to protests. Number 2, communication and technology. Does your congregation have a Zoom account or access to Facebook Live or YouTube or any other streaming service, which you can quickly post video messages or lend to an emerging group that needs to communicate quickly? Here's one I hadn't thought of. Does our congregation's Wi-Fi extend to an outdoor sheltered area? Do we have a system in place for quickly mobilizing people? Phone communication tree? Do we have a protocol that the leaders know for securing messages? And how about, do we have access to all the members' contact information in an easily acceptable place? And here's a good one. Do we have a plan for checking up on members in case of quickly escalating uprising, disruption, or violence? Probably have their cell phone numbers handy so we can check up on them, see if they need support or help. Finances is number 3. Do you have a discretionary fund? And if you do, what's the transparency for giving out the money to organizations that might need it in a moment's notice? Do we have a way to rapidly fundraise for an organization? And then a clear way to track the money for emergency purposes. Maybe there's a list of donors, maybe some are on the call today, who could be quickly approached for emergency needs. The 4th is the volunteer base. I never thought of this. Do we have a map where all the members live by address so that if something flares up, you know who's in the area? Have we ever taken a survey of our members to see what kinds of actions they'd be willing to take in spite of COVID, obviously? And then could we quickly mobilize people for different actions? Even if you're in a shelter in place mode because you need to be, there's things like meal prep. Maybe we need pans of lasagna to help feed people, or maybe transportation or supply triage or direct action or protest. So there's all kinds of things where you could be mobilized to help. Do we have a system in place to help volunteers mobilize or recruit other people? Number 5, this one has a list of almost anything you can think of you could help. The first and most important is relationships with those who hold power locally. The local or state elected official, higher education institutions, interfaith groups, nonprofits. This is where I think we excel. All 3 congregations the members and friends are heavily involved in the community and know who these people are. That's an asset in times like this. Do we have a social action committee that is organized, that can get out easily? I know we do in these congregations. Then other things like translators, visual artists for posters, social media experts, song leaders and musicians. If they're waiting in the parking lot, you can calm them down or pump them up. Photographers or videographers, excuse me. How about public relations? We could use spokespeople with media training. In my area, pastoral or spiritual care. If you've got medical expertise, street medics, writers, lawyers, childcare workers, drivers, cooks, donors, the list goes on to be available to help. And then finally, community partners. Again, what are the existing relationships we have with community partners? And can our congregation amplify or participate in or fundraise for them? Think through who's mostly impacted by oppression, and I'll get back to that in a minute. What are our relationships with other faith leaders in town? Can we pull our resources together? Or how about collaborating with other Unitarian Universalist congregations? Clearly we do. There's 3 of us together today, and I know Door County has joined, and Paula, the president, is on today, and she sent me an email saying that their board had already considered what they might do to help, and it was in the way of providing water and maybe some snacks for people that are out protesting. And she mentioned that they highly doubt that there'll be something happening up in Sister Bay, maybe in Sturgeon Bay, but probably in Green Bay. So Natalie, maybe you and Paula should talk. We need to identify the people in our communities who the extreme right vigilantes would probably target. African Americans, Indigenous people, Asian Americans, Latina, LGBTQ plus folks, particularly transgender folks, non-Christians, Jews, Muslims, Unitarian Universalists, pagans, or the politically liberal, Democrats, socialists, environmentalists. Figure out what connections we have in the relationships, and we need to reach out. Let them know we're ready to show up and support them. I guess I'll conclude with just saying the message is we need to think about this and be ready and choose to be intentional about it. Those of you on the board or the leadership of the congregation, be ready at a moment's notice for a virtual meeting to make decisions, or perhaps meet now and have advance directives of what we agreed to do and not do. Have supplies and funds ready. Security. How do we secure ourselves? Staffing, of course. It's always part of it. So I'll close with the same metaphor that was used before in the reading. The baby's about to be born for the world that we want to live in. It's time to really step into the delivery room and get out of the waiting room and demonstrate that we uphold and support the democratic process. We need to let those who need help know they can lean on us. Amen.